First of all, because I probably won't be back here for a few months, Happy New Year. May you be inscribed in the Book of Life. For those of you who aren't of the Jewish faith, may you also be inscribed in the Book of Life. It's an honor to be here to talk to my friend Bari about her book. And I guess I'll start with the heaviest part of the book, which is the inspiration for the book, which is the horrific shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in your hometown of Pittsburgh. How did that turn into this?
So, first of all, thank you so much for doing this and schlepping from DC, and I'm so happy to have all of you here. Great. I would say that my life sort of changed with a text message. I was always someone who cared deeply about Jewish issues. When people asked me, are you a Jewish American, an American Jew, I was always like puzzled by the question, because my Jewishness has sort of been at the forefront of my life for my entire life. And anti-Semitism was something, frankly, that I was very aware of. I remember so clearly sort of coming alive to politics during the Second Intifada and watching what was going on there. I remember the torture of Ilan Halimi, so I was very aware of what was going on. But frankly, I thought that anti-Semitism was something that happened to Jews in other places. I thought that we were uniquely protected, inoculated from this virus that's been in our civilization for forever. And I would say that that really changed when I got this text message on the morning of October 27th, 2018. And it was a text message from my sister on our family chat, and it said, there's a shooter at Tree of Life. And my thought immediately went to my dad, who often is at Minyan there on Shabbat morning. Thank God he wasn't there, but he knew 7 of the people that were killed. I had met many of them myself. And
you had been bat mitzvahed there, even though that's not your synagogue.
Yeah, I had been bat mitzvahed there because in a sort of typical Pittsburghian, shtetl-like Mr. Rogers neighborhood looking out for one another way, there had been a fire at my synagogue, and Tree of Life had stepped in, and everyone who was supposed to become a bat mitzvah at Beth Shalom became a bat mitzvah at Tree of Life that year. We're a really tight-knit community. And so anyway, I went home after the shooting. I was supposed to go to Israel that week to report on a story. I ended up pushing it off and went home to just kind of bear witness to what the shooter had done and the response, not just of the Jewish community, but of the Pittsburgh community as well. But even after that, Jake, I was convinced that it was just a one-off, honestly, and the illusion of that myth was shattered 6 months to the day on April 27th when another white supremacist walked into a synagogue in Poway, California with the same intention, wanting to kill as many Jews as possible. So now I find myself, like probably many people in this room who were raised on the mythology that this is the Golden Medina, this is the best diaspora in diaspora history. Still is true, by the way. I still believe that. And I wrote this book because I believe we have a chance to push this back and fight it. But I find myself sort of asking questions I had never asked before. Like, could it happen here? It could mean different things. You know, are we sort of not protected from the threat? When you say it,
what do you mean, could it happen here? What do you...
Could we be living in a reality something closer to what the Jews of Paris and London experience? Could we put baseball hats over our kippot or put our Magen Davids inside our shirt when we walk down the streets of Crown Heights? That's not a crazy, hysterical question to ask anymore, when in the last week of August, 4 visibly Jewish people were violently assaulted, one beaten with his own belt, one smashed in the face with a brick. I know parents in Brooklyn who are worried about their children walking around with kippot. I never thought that in 2019 we would ever be asking that question here. And then to go to the London thing, and that's sort of a different model. What's happening there, because of the way that anti-Semitism has spread on the left and in the Labor Party, is that people are increasingly hiding their support and affinity for Israel. They don't want to ruin a dinner party, they don't want to be called a racist, they don't want to be smeared as any number of things. So that increasingly becomes something that is shunted and private. And so that is another way that our identity is threatened. Sometimes it's physical violence, sometimes it's fear of social ostracism or moral condemnation. But that is the way that anti-Semitism is working right now. It's coming at us from all of these different directions at all at once, which is what makes it so difficult to fight.
And the book, I think you got this from another writer who you footnote, but who you credit. But the book distinguishes between what you call Purim anti-Semitism and Hanukkah anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
Explain what you mean by that, or what the...
Dara Horn. So Dara Horn is the greatest. She's like a Rebbe to me, even though she's not a rabbi. I'm going to be very uncomfortable with that description. She's a novelist. And she's written many really, really important essays recently for the Jewish Review of Books, sort of putting our moment in historical context. And she wrote this essay where she exactly says that all anti-Semitism in history can be divided into Purim and Hanukkah. Purim, as in the story of Purim, is Haman-like anti-Semitism. It announces itself bluntly. It says, all Jews must die, and we're going to kill as many Jews as possible. That's the anti-Semitism of the Islamic Republic of Iran. That's the anti-Semitism of Hamas. That's the anti-Semitism of the white supremacist Robert Bowers, who walked into the synagogue in Pittsburgh. And the thing about Purim anti-Semitism, even though it's more violent, for sure, more physically violent, is that it's very, very blunt in what it seeks. It doesn't try and hide itself and pretend to be something that it's not. Hanukkah anti-Semitism, as in the story of Hanukkah, is different. It does not say to the Jews, we want to kill you. It says, you can remain a Jew. All you need to do to remain a Jew and remain safe, and for us not to kill you, is to disavow everything that makes you Jewish. Is to flush thousands of years of Jewish civilization, religion, literature, our texts, everything, flush it down the toilet, and then you're okay. You're okay with us until you're not. This is the anti-Semitism of the Soviet Union. It is the anti-Semitism, of Lenin and Stalin, and it is the anti-Semitism of the Labor Party. And unfortunately, it is the anti-Semitism of sort of the far left activist and academic crowd in the United States. So these are, I think it's just a really, really useful rubric, because what Hanukkah anti-Semitism does is that it forces the Jews to sort of disavow their particularism. So historically, that's meant, as in the Soviet Union, you can't be religious, because that was the anathema to the communists. Now it means you need to disavow Jewish power, and you need to disavow the prime example and symbol of Jewish power, which is the Jewish state.
So let's talk about that, because I want to get to the Purim anti-Semitism in a second, which is the Robert Bowers Tree of Life anti-Semitism. But let's talk about that for 1 second, because I want to understand what you mean by the anti-Semitism of the left, because certainly I know, at least, and you write in the book, that you don't think that criticizing Netanyahu or criticizing the government of Israel or criticizing the way that Palestinians are treated in the West Bank and the blockade in Gaza, that you don't think that is definitionally anti-Semitism, right?
Not in the least. I think in the same way that it's patriotic to criticize the Trump administration, to criticize what's happening at the border, to criticize the way that this president is trashing the very best of American traditions. I think to criticize all of that makes me an American patriot. In the same way, I think criticizing Israeli government policies that trash Jewish values, and I mean that in this sort of, I can explain what I mean by that, but it's cozying up to neo-fascist regimes like Viktor Orban in Hungary or Bolsonaro in Brazil. It's giving control over Jewish religious life in Israel to the ultra-Orthodox. It's any number of things that are happening. I think to criticize those things, and certainly the treatment of the Palestinians, I think that makes me a Zionist. To me, there's no conflict between the two. Unfortunately, what the far left tries to do as a tactic is to conflate Zionism with Bibiism. No one, it's a straw man that I find incredibly frustrating, because what Zionism is, fundamentally, is the most ancient Jewish yearning, which is to return to the land, the indigenous land where Jews have always been for 5,000 years. And yet people are trying to convince me and say to me in lots of public forums and sometimes on the street that that's not actually what it is, that Zionism is actually about supporting every policy of the Israeli government. And I just fundamentally reject that.
So let's go back to the Purim Hanukkah metaphor, which is the question of what is the greatest threat right now, because one of the criticisms of not just your book, but your op-eds and you,
yes,
is that the criticism I hear is people on the right are literally walking into synagogues and killing Jews.
I'm very aware of that.
I know you're aware of that, but I'm just saying, like, this is the criticism, okay? I'm relaying it. People on the right are literally walking into synagogues and killing Jews. There is tighter security here than the first time I came here at the 92nd Street Y, okay? I went to my niece's bat mitzvah in western Massachusetts, in a small town, and they had security. I mean, I didn't even know that they had a synagogue, and they have security outside the synagogue. And they're not there for the left, right? I mean, they're there for anybody, but the fear is the people who think that George Soros and you and me and Brett Stevens and whoever, Eli Lake, that we're all part of this big cabal, and we're trying to import Latinos, Mexicans, Guatemalans, to come here for the great replacement theory.
That's Jews will not replace us.
Right. That's the great deranged thing going on. And it's a conspiracy theory that we've heard from people in the US government, by the way, parts of it.
It's Steve King when he says our civilization cannot be replaced with someone else's babies.
So the question is, how can you even talk about the left when that's going on the right?
I guess, to me, that question is, first of all, I reject the idea that I'm soft on white supremacy or that I'm not aware of its effects.
I'm not.
No, I know.
I'm cleaning it up a little bit.
It's okay. It's okay.
I didn't relay that one.
It's okay. You should see. And by the way, I mean,
Don't. I keep telling you, put on the quality filter.
I did put on the quality
and then delete
filter.
Twitter.
I did it backstage.
But the book has the right, the left, and the Muslim world, or Islamists. And you're unsparing, right? I mean, anybody who accuses you of being pro-Trump clearly hasn't read your tweets, your columns, and certainly not your book.
I mean, and certainly, I left a job over Trump. So
right.
Yes.
But the left is in here too.
Of course.
Yeah.
I guess to me, it's like there are two fundamental threats we're facing right now. One is a physical threat. It's the threat that's making me, as I told you backstage, move buildings to be in a more secure location. I take that threat real seriously. And there's no question in my mind that if someone, God forbid, was going to walk in here and try and kill us, that person 9 times out of 10 is going to be a white supremacist. Definitely. But there's another threat, and that's the threat that's trying to turn us into white supremacists. That is the threat from the left. They are saying that because I think the number is 95 or 98% of Jews identify as pro-Israel or Zionists or support the state of Israel, which, by the way, has nothing to do with Israeli government policy because a majority of American Jews are critical of Israeli government policy. Again, two separate things.
Yeah, I think you don't have to tell these people, but okay.
Okay.
My guess.
But I think it is a huge threat for people to try and suggest that we are the handmaidens of white supremacy, which is what the left is trying to do. And that has all kinds of effects that are not as obvious as someone walking in here with a gun. They're what's happening to Jews that I hear from on college campuses every single day around the country. Like Doria Khan, a student at NYU, who has been told in the heart of Manhattan that 6 million is not a real number, that she should never complain about being a victim because Jews are the most privileged people in America. Like my sister, first week of school at University of Michigan, overheard a conversation between two people. One said, I don't really think I can date that guy. He's great, but he's a Zionist. Or the piece that was published yesterday from a student at Hofstra. She's a religious woman. 2 roommates asked to move because they didn't want to live with someone who was a religious Jew. A professor told her that he would not reschedule things for the high holidays, and then told her, imagine a world without Jews. Imagine that happening. You should Google it. Google Hofstra, Lila Edelman is her name. Imagine that happening to any other minority, and yet that's like, no one bats an eyelash. I find that amazing. And what that kind of anti-Semitism, as in Hanukkah anti-Semitism, what it does is it tries to it opens the space for there to be more and more for anti-Semitism to become more and more socially acceptable. Mm-hmm. And for Jews, whatever their Jewish identity, whether it's religious identity, Zionist identity, for those things to become an obstacle to them or something that's a liability. And it's been quite successful at that.
Well, it is interesting, I will say, that it does seem that even talking about Israel in a benign or anodyne way is different now on social media or in just reporting on it than it was 20 years ago.
Yeah, but in a way it's deeper than that. It's like we are living in the world that the Soviet Union created, because when the Soviets failed through its proxies in the Arab world to defeat the actual Israel, the actual Jewish state, it took that into a propaganda war, which it waged in, among other places, in the United Nations, right? And that sort of...
Zionism is racism.
Zionism is racism. We are living in a world created by that resolution, which was later repealed, but we're living in the follow-on effects of that. Because if Zionism is racism, and Zionists are racist, then I'm a racist, and everyone knows what should happen to racists.
Well, let me ask you a question. The treatment of see, this gets into complicated ideas, because then you're talking about, we're talking about Zionism, we're talking about Israel. Jimmy Carter wrote a book several years ago. It was very controversial, in which he suggested that the treatment of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza at the time, I believe, amounted to apartheid. That was very controversial at the time. In 2019, I don't know that it's as controversial, not because the dialogue has shifted as much to the left, but because it does seem fairly clear that the Netanyahu government, and he's the longest serving prime minister in the history of the Jewish state, I believe, that the Netanyahu government has absolutely no intention of ever giving full rights to the Palestinians in the West Bank, which is the definition of apartheid. What do you think of that? What do you think of the treatment of the Palestinians, not as a Jew, but as a Zionist?
I think that it's untenable, as I've written and spoken about many times before, for Israel to be a liberal democratic state and occupy another people who don't enjoy equal rights, period. It is not just for the sake of Palestinians who are immiserated in two ways, by Israel, but also by their own government, which we never talk about. I want them to be able to express their national rights, A, because I care about human rights, but B, because I care about Israel. And I don't think it's in Israel's interest to continue that indefinitely. The problem is that Israel's in a sort of impossible situation, as people like Yossi Klein Halevi have written about. Let's say it pulls out of the West Bank tomorrow. Hamas comes to power. How does it protect itself? I mean, honestly, how does it protect itself? Look at what happened in Gaza. I mean, we have to be honest about the region that this country is situated in. The region that Israel is situated in, is the reality of it is what happened to Jamal Khashoggi in that Saudi embassy. It is absolutely brutal, and to suggest that, and this is one of the amazing things to me about what BDS proponents try and advocate for. We just want a binational state. It'll be so great, kumbaya. I'm sorry. Look at the reality of minorities in the Middle East that do not have an army. Look at the Zoroastrians, look at the Yazidis, look at the Kurds, and frankly, look at the Christians who will not exist in the Middle East 10 years from now. That's just reality. And frankly, I think a lot of times people trying to lodge these sort of complaints about Israel without acknowledging that are just fundamentally uncomfortable with the idea of Jews wielding any power at all.
So I just
want to add one thing, which is...
Add away.
Jewish history makes it very, very clear. There is a sort of imaginary universe of history where these people are trying to claim that Jews can be sort of morally pure and safe at the same time, and that's just not true. I mean, Jews have been, the reason that the past 70 years have been the best for Jews since the year 70, when the temple was destroyed, is because of the state of Israel. It's because it gave Jews a safe haven. And by the way, it failed to save most of the Jews of the Holocaust, but you know who it did save? The Jews of the Arab world, who now represent a majority of people that live in the land of Israel. So when people are opposed to the existence of any Jewish state between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, I would suggest to them that they're not opposing an abstraction. They are opposing a real place where the majority of people that live there are Jews of color, to use the current parlance.
Before I want to make sure that I get to this, and so I'm just going to interject. So you went on Bill Maher on Friday night.
I did.
And one of the things that you said, and I'll give you the full opportunity to provide full context, I'm just reading from a tweet here. Barry Weiss said the left only cares about Muslims. It's the left, not Muslims, but the left only cares about Muslims when it involves Israel. Quote, this is you being quoted, "There are a million Uyghurs in China, Muslims in concentration camps. Somehow the left, who claim to care so much about Muslim lives, don't talk about that." Now, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, whom you've criticized.
Old friend of mine, yes.
She tweeted something about that. Should I just read that, or do you want to talk about what you said? Okay, so Congresswoman Ilhan Omar this afternoon tweeted, "I have been speaking out against the ethnic cleansing of the Uyghur population since I came to Congress, along with many of my progressive colleagues. I even co-sponsored 2 bills to hold China accountable. The idea that we do not care about Muslim lives is a vile smear." Okay, so I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to that.
So first of all, I'm very glad to hear that she sponsored that bill. I look forward to her leading a boycott, divest, and sanctions campaign against China. It's a lie to suggest, everyone who looks at the world, looks at this country, understands that the energy on the left, on college campuses, let me put it this way. I don't see college students protesting in front of Chinese embassies. I don't see college students talking about what's going on in Hong Kong and leading protests through campus about that. I see them putting up apartheid walls. So I'm thrilled that she sponsored that bill, but the idea that the energy on the left is not inordinately, crazily focused on this tiny local conflict is ridiculous.
Now, to play devil's advocate, the response would be that $3 to $4 billion of U.S. aid goes to Israel every year and does not go to China.
Sure, but the U.S. offers security guarantees to Saudi Arabia, and I don't see a BDS campaign against Saudi Arabia.
Okay. Again, to play devil's advocate, the answer is, because I remember I did an interview with Congresswoman Tlaib, and I pressed her on the BDS movement and why isn't she condemning Saudi Arabia, et cetera, and she said show her the bill and she'll sign up, and I got criticized a lot.
She's a congresswoman, she can propose the bill.
That was what I said, but the criticism I got from the left was, this is typical Zionist propaganda. Don't look at this problem here that we're trying to bring attention to. What about this problem? What about this problem? What about this problem? And so I ask you, that is the criticism of this. Okay, instead of talking about what Israel is doing to the Palestinians, you want to talk about the Uyghurs in China, but you haven't written any columns about the Uyghurs in China. Why won't you address that, and why won't you focus on this?
Because I think that the focus on this, the obsessive focus on this, is evidence of an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. I'll tell you why. The very idea that peace in the Middle East runs through the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and not through, say, Sunnis and Shiites is a lie. The idea that the United Nations Human Rights Council between 2006 and 2016 passed 68 resolutions condemning the Jewish state, 0 for China, 0 for Pakistan, I think 4 for North Korea, which is a slave state. Tell me how that's not evidence of a conspiracy theory against the Jewish state. I fail to see that. I really do. And as for, I think it's just also really, really important. Ilhan Omar went on Face the Nation today. She didn't talk about the Uyghurs. She didn't talk about probably the greatest democratic movement in the 21st century, which is happening right now in Hong Kong. And frankly, too few people are talking about it. She talked about the BDS movement and her promotion of the BDS movement. And the BDS movement, as Omar Barghouti, the founder of that movement, has said, no Palestinian will ever accept a Jewish state, period. So again, I just don't understand how that's anything other than anti-Semitism. If the Jews are a people, and peoples have a right to a nation state, then why do only the Jews not have a right to it? You have to go back, and the lies that is built on is the lie that the Jews are not actually a people, which is a total distortion and denial of our history. And I refuse to comply with that.
You point out the discrepancy between the left saying that Jews are white and in fact the worst white supremacists that exist, and the far left and the far right. The far left saying that, and the far right saying that Jews are not whites.
Right.
And that this is, this is where Jews find ourselves. What do you think? What are we?
Well, you appear to be white. You are of Eastern European descent, I imagine. You're an Ashkenazi Jew, but race itself is a construct, period. So I just don't buy into that.
So it doesn't matter.
I'm not, okay, let me be really clear. Many of us in this room pass as white people all day long, and we enjoy the privileges of that. And I will never deny that. I walk around the world and I look like a white person. Of course I enjoy the privileges of that. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not suggesting that Jews don't enjoy looking the way we do, or at least some of us. 15% of American Jews are Jews of color, by the way. It's that what the far left is trying to do is strip us of our ability to be victims in any way at all, and they're forcing the choice. You're either on the side of the oppressed or on the side of the oppressor. And if you want to be a part of the coalition of the oppressed, you need to publicly disavow any kind of Jewish power at all.
What do you mean by Jewish power? Support for Israel, what else?
Support for Israel, Jewish success, apologizing for Jewish success. It's frankly ignoring any kind of anti-Semitism that doesn't come from white supremacists. It's very complicated when, I mentioned in August, the last week of August, there were 4 attacks on ultra-Orthodox Jews. And I think in the majority of those cases, someone can check me, but in the majority of violence that's been happening in Brooklyn, often that's coming from young black men. Now that's really, really uncomfortable thing to talk about because they are both victimizing people in our community and they are also victims themselves of systemic racism and of police brutality and of any number of things that I'm not just ready to admit that I cared very, very deeply about. So what do we do in that case? A white supremacist, in a way, is just a much cleaner case because they're just evil, and what do you do when someone who is themselves a victim is also a victimizer? I think that is one of the reasons that people in our community are so loath to talk about the Linda Sarsours or the Ilhan Omars, or frankly, the anti-Semitism of some Islamists in Europe, because they are themselves the subject of systemic oppressions. And it's just very, very uncomfortable and hard, because you don't want to be a person that's also piling on and contributing to bigotry and xenophobia and all of the rest of the things that many of those people have to endure, which is one of the reasons I tried to avoid writing about Islam in this book, because it's really, really uncomfortable.
Some of the people on the left say that those who say that Congresswoman Ilhan Omar and Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, those who say they have trafficked in anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic tropes, are smearing them and taking them out of context. And that's not what they said, that they were suggesting that AIPAC is powerful, that they were suggesting that money is part of the political system, but they weren't saying things that were explicitly anti-Semitic. What do you think about that?
Well, I was the person, I wrote a column about Ilhan Omar and the anti-Semitic tropes that she responded to. I invited her to come into the New York Times. The invitation stands. I would love to meet her. And I took her at her word that she really didn't know what she was stumbling into when she said, I think Israel hypnotized the world, it's all about the Benjamins. Okay, I want to give someone the benefit of the doubt. What I can't give the benefit of the doubt to is, frankly, supporting the BDS movement, which is much more, it's much more of a threat than tossing off ugly, vile tropes about our people.
What do you think about Jews who support BDS? I mean, there might, you write about that sect of Orthodox Jews who don't believe in Israel. Mm-hmm. They're definitely a fringe group, but there are Jewish Americans who think that Israel is colonialist, oppressive, et cetera, and they support BDS.
They do. I would say that
Thank you. Good questions.
I'll give you an historical example that I've been thinking a lot about. In around the time of the Maccabees and the Hanukkah story, the Jews were, and Gratz writes about this in his History of the Jews. Dara Horn's also written about this, so this is how it came to mind. She wrote about this in an essay about the Evsexia, which is an interesting thing we could also talk about. The Jewish boys, teenagers and young men, were so desperate to fit into the surrounding society. And they wanted to pass off as non-Jews in the gymnasium, where you obviously exercised in the nude. So they actually underwent an ancient surgery to undo their circumcisions. The reason I bring that up—
I heard some audible groans.
Don't vomit. This is real. It's really real, and the details are—
I feel like they just made me think about it. No thanks.
The reason I bring that up is that the desire to be a part of the cool group and the desire to be a part of the group that you always thought was your home, and the deep psychological discomfort of realizing it might not be, is very powerful. Look at what happened in Stalin's Russia, okay? There was the Anti-Fascist Committee. What was the Anti-Fascist Committee? It was Stalin's, PR group that was made up of Jews. Lenin had the same thing. They were called the Yevsektia. They were determined to prove that they were loyal Bolsheviks. And so what did they do? They went and they literally write about this. It's in my book.
Yes.
But they write about, we need to prove that we are loyal members of the Bolshevik Party. And in order to do that, we need to go harder, and they literally say this in their version of Pravda, which was called MS, or the truth. It was not the truth. We need to go harder against the rabbis and against our co-religionists, and especially against the Zionists, to show that we are loyal members of the party. And so this is something with a very, very long history. And frankly, when I look at Jews who support the BDS movement, I feel sympathy because I understand, I think, emotionally what's driving that. It's a deep, deep desire to feel a part of a tribe, and maybe even, maybe I'll be even more circumspect than this. I think a lot of people that support the BDS movement and call themselves anti-Zionist really don't know what they're talking about. I mean that in a generous way. I don't mean that in the sense of like they don't understand history, they don't understand politics. What I mean is that they are swimming in waters in which they are around people who oppose all kinds of things and support all kinds of things that are progressive and good. They're for, criminal justice reform. They're for legalizing marijuana. They're for raising the minimum wage. Oh, and by the way, they're for BDS. And so I think a lot of people that are subscribing to this don't really understand what makes it so dangerous. And I really hope to reach those people.
I want to ask you one question, and I want to say it was interesting reading this because at one point you start quoting somebody. I went to Akiba Hebrew Academy outside Philadelphia, and at one point you quote a guy named Zev Magen, who when I knew him he was Billy Magen, but we went to Akiba Hebrew Academy, and I said, that's funny, I went to school with him, and you said, yes, there are only 5 Jews. But one other thing one of your biggest critics was a couple years behind me at camp. He is a cartoonist named Eli Valley, I've
heard of him.
You've heard of him. He does, I don't know how to pronounce it. He does grotesques, I think is a accurate way to describe the caricature.
You're the cartoonist, not me. I don't know.
And well, that's how I knew him, because he was a couple years behind me, and you don't normally mingle in camp between the different age groups, but he was a talented cartoonist. But he is a critic of yours, and he, I think, was really upset when you lent support to a Jewish student on campus who on Stanford who didn't want him to come speak. And I just wondered, because you've been very critical of the cancel movement, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, and even the way you talk about Ilhan Omar, about like giving them what in Judaism is called dan lakaf zichos, the idea of giving somebody the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they didn't understand what they were saying, but you didn't do that for Eli, and I wondered what you...
Well, what I did was I retweeted a column that was a good column, I felt, by Ari Hoffman, you should look it up, that explained why these cartoons were so grotesque. That's what I did. And unfortunately, that person has used it as oxygen and turned me into a kind of boogeyman, because it's useful for him to have me as that foil.
Yeah, okay. So let me turn to some of the other questions that are from the audience. What is the climate, this is for both of us, but I'll let you go.
Okay.
Because I'm the questioner, not the answerer. What is the climate for Jewish journalists right now that the public does not know and is not aware of?
Oof. Well, there's a lot of Jews in the media.
That's anti-Semitic.
No, that's just true. We were kept out of a lot of other things. It's like Jews built Hollywood. Yeah, because they weren't allowed to do a million other things. Jews are in finance. Why? I mean, it's like there's truth to some stereotypes.
I was joking.
Well, I'm joking back. What was right, Jews in media.
Is it tough to be, were you on the list when the ADL did their thing about the Jews that were being attacked by Nazis the most?
I think I would be on it.
I was number 6.
Right, I think Ben.
I don't want to brag.
Ben Shapiro was 1. Maybe you were like, it was like Ben Shapiro, Julia Yaffe, Jake Tapper. It's like an all-time hit list.
Yeah, but Ben was like way up there. It was like
Ben and then everyone else.
9 million.
I hadn't yet come to the New York Times yet, is the truth. So I was not yet.
I'm sorry.
I was not yet in the fires. Now I would say that I'd make the. I hope.
I think you're definitely top 5. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
What and I mean, because
I think Jews that are just bit like Jews that like Seinfeld and hummus and bagels, have no problem in the media or anywhere else.
Yeah.
I think Jews that are outspoken about Israel or outspoken about Jewish particularism or outspoken about Jewish peoplehood. Jews like me, they're going to have more problems. But that's not just journalism. That's frankly anywhere right now in the places where Jews live, right?
Yeah.
In the places where Jews live, which is largely progressive and liberal spaces.
In 2017, the big thing was, just to clue you in, because I know you weren't part of the cool club of Jewish journalists being attacked. The cool thing was, and by the way, it was all from the right. All of it was from Trump supporters, or people pretending to be Trump supporters on social media, and they were actually 13-year-olds from Macedonia. Who knows? But in Macedonia, not just from. But it was to depict you on a body in a gas chamber.
Yeah.
And Donald Trump as an SS officer about to turn the gas on. Mm-hmm. And this was back before. If you think Twitter has no standards now, you should have seen them in 2017. Yeah, it was really crazy.
But do you feel like the attacks are 100% from Trump supporters still, or has that changed? Because I saw you tweet something anodyne the other day, and people were not attacking you from the right.
No, yeah, I retweeted a Bernie Sanders tweet that featured Linda Sarsour endorsing him, and I guess she's been a surrogate of his. I didn't know, by the way. Apparently, she's been a supporter of his since 2015. I don't really pay a lot of attention to her, so I didn't know. And I just noted Linda Sarsour endorses Bernie Sanders. I thought it was interesting. That's pretty much it. And I got attacked for being an Islamophobe. I thought that was because people, I think, were just projecting a lot of feelings into my head that I was not having. I was like, oh, isn't this interesting? Click. And people were thinking, oh, he's Muslim baiting, which I was not doing. But I don't, that's the world. But I don't know if is calling me an imperialist Zionist and calling for me to be fired the same thing as the Nazi in the gas chamber graphic. I don't know.
They're different.
Both were unpleasant, but I think the Nazi one was worse.
It's worse.
This is kind of like the subtext of your book that we're talking about, like which is worse. Like these people thought I was being anti-Muslim, and I wasn't, but they thought I was, and they were attacking me for that.
But the person I'll just put it this way, the person that creates, or the person of the ideology that creates that horrible meme of your face in the gas chamber, they're never going to be invited into polite society. The person that calls you an Islamophobe and a Zionist imperialist will get invited on television. That's the difference.
That's probably true. Let me get my glasses out again. I should probably just keep them on. What do you make of what's happening inside the New York Times right now? What does it mean that reporters inside the paper of record have criticized you and your work? And can I just say something just as a journalist, and CNN's a big company. We have something like 5,000 employees, and you might be surprised to find out that I don't like and agree with everyone. But I don't crap all over them or leak stuff about them. And the people who do that, whether they're doing it to Bari or they're doing it to Dean, it's just, I mean, I don't know how I feel about that, but I don't think it's especially off the record.
I think you know how you feel about that.
Well, it's like put your name on it. If you're going to do it, put your name on it. Like why would you do it on background? Like, either stand up and say what you believe or don't, but don't try to have it both ways. That's my personal take, but I'm sorry.
My take is that I'm lucky to work at the greatest newspaper in the world. And I understand that the New York, trust me, I have Jewish parents. I know how the strong feelings that people have about the New York Times. All I can say is that I have had nothing but the unfettered support of the publisher and of my bosses at the paper, and I never would have been able to become the writer that I am. I mean, I was writing for many years at the Wall Street Journal before I came to the New York Times. There's just simply no platform like the Times, and for that, they have supported me in everything that I've done, including this book, and I'm just really, really grateful to have that platform.
Do you define the policies of Netanyahu as racist? And does his tenure trigger racists in the U.S. to raise anti-Semitism in the U.S.?
I think Netanyahu makes defending Israel harder, but I reject the idea that Jews are responsible for anti-Semitism ever. I think that that's a really insidious way of thinking. And unfortunately, people ask me that all the time. Frankly, on Bill Maher, I mean, I wrote a book about anti-Semitism. Jews have been the target of more anti-Semitic attacks than any other religious group since 1995. Like, this isn't a new thing.
In the United States.
In the United States, yeah. Yeah, the FBI, yes, in the United States. And yet, when the response within a minute of me talking about that is, but what about the policies of Benjamin Netanyahu? I'm like, really? That's the response? The response is not, this is horrible, what can we be doing about it? I mean, that itself reveals like a very screwed up mentality that somehow the Jews are responsible. I was talking to a student at NYU, a lovely young man who went to Yeshiva University for undergrad. He wears a big kippah, and he's at NYU in his first year of law school. And he came up to me in tears a little after an event, and he said in his first week at NYU, someone screamed at him, "Effing Jew." And he was
a student?
A student. Who screamed it at him? Yeah. I'm not sure.
Okay.
But the person in the bodega heard it. He was in a bodega or a 7-Eleven, and he said, "Oh my God, did you hear that? Can you believe it?" And the person said to him, "Well, what did you do to ask for it?" That's the mentality of that. When it's Benjamin Netanyahu is doing something horrible, therefore X, Y, and Z Jew, you need to answer for it. I reject that completely. Do I think he's a racist? Yeah, of course. Yes, Benjamin Netanyahu has done a lot of racist things, including oftentimes before elections, when he encourages Arabs to stay at home, when he has invited Otzma Yehudit, the successors to Mayor Kahana's disgusting politics, into his coalition. Of course. So is Donald Trump. That doesn't make me hate America. I still love America, and I still love Israel.
It's not the same person, but I'll just make it a follow-up. What do I tell my brother as he heads to the polls in Tel Aviv on Tuesday? I think you just actually heard.
Yeah, but I would say look, I'm a centrist. I love Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz. I think that they answer Israelis who are rightly scared about their security, that they offer the answer to that in a really, really convincing way. And also are mensches and are not going to traffic in the kind of ugly things that Netanyahu does.
You know, one thing that I wanted to ask you, the book is very timely. Sadly, it could probably be timely in 10 years or 10 years ago.
I kept clawing it back to update it.
Right. But you weren't able to include, because I already had my copy, Donald Trump saying that Jews who vote Democratic are disloyal, and then the next day pressed for clarity, said they're disloyal to Israel and to their fellow Jews. Mm-hmm. Now, probably a few of them are in this room, Jews who vote Democratic, given where we are. It's not in your book only because of deadlines.
Truly, I mean.
That would be in chapter 1, I know. But what was your reaction?
I wrote a column that day about it.
I'm sorry, I was on just so you know, I was on vacation that week.
It was a good column that I was.
I'm sure it was fantastic, but I didn't read it because I was.
I think that the notion of provisional belonging is something that has been weaponized against the Jews for all of our history. It's disgusting, it is dangerous, and when Donald Trump traffics in it, as George Will has said, he is ringing bells that cannot be unrung. I don't care how many good for Israel policies this president has passed, and I've supported several of them. That, to me, like, nothing is worth the price of that. Nothing. Nothing is worth the price of turning Americans one against another. And frankly, when he said of the squad, I mean, the other thing that I did make it into the book, because it happened in July.
That's in there, yep.
I took it back just to put this in. I'm sure you all remember when he said that they need to go back to the totally broken and crime-infested places that they came from, okay? In his sort of demolishing of them in a disgusting and racist way, he also included a defense of Israel, right? I mean, it was all about how they hate Israel, and so therefore they're not really American, and I just think that that does Israel no favors, and that the idea that people who are born American citizens, or in one case a naturalized citizen who's sworn to uphold the Constitution, regardless of what they believe, and I think you know from the past conversation, I strongly disagree with them. I think that that is absolutely vile, and I was glad I got that in the book. I'm sorry about the disloyal thing.
What do you think when you see people like Congressman Lee Zeldin, Republican from New York, or Matt Brooks, the executive director of the Republican Jewish Coalition, defending President Trump on the question about what he said about Jews? Because I just want to make it perfectly clear, and you'll forgive me this indulgence, I was off, so I wasn't able to broadcast about this, so I have some pent-up commentary.
Rage.
Well, thoughts about it, let's say.
Yeah, thoughts.
President Trump said that 60 to 70% of the Jews in the United States who vote are disloyal to their fellow Jews and to Israel. That's what he said.
Yes.
Because most Jews vote for Democrats. And most Jews do not vote on the basis of Israel alone. So basically, President Trump said about my dad and my mom and a lot of people in this room and my brother and his wife that they are disloyal to Jews and they are disloyal to Israel. President Trump said that. And when you see people like Lee Zeldin, Congressman Zeldin, and Matt Brooks defending it, what do you think?
I think it's a mirror image of the BDS Jews. I mean, it's like it's being slavishly loyal to party and politics and not seeing that for what it is. I mean, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's gross. It's gross. I mean, it really is.
That's it. I was just looking for an adjective.
But, yeah. But I also feel, I mean, I should say that, like, there's a lot of sorousness in our community, Broigus might be the word, about...
Broigus?
Yeah, like
I don't know Broigus. What is
like fighting, like there's just a lot of anxiety and angst about Trump, okay? Like, before I go and speak, and I'm just, like, maybe that's not reflected in this room, but before, I've been speaking to communities all over the country, Jewish communities, and every time before I go, I get a call. Please avoid Trump. There's people in our community that support Trump. Please avoid him. And it's just really interesting to me that there's so much, people feel torn about this. And I think one of the reasons they feel torn is that even though, you know, Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi are still in charge, I think they sense that the winds are at the back of people like AOC and Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, and they're nervous about that. And they're looking across the pond at the Labour Party in England, and they're like, God forbid that would happen to the Democratic Party.
So this also gets into one of the things that your critics say that I want to ask you about.
We're spending a lot of time on my critics tonight.
I just think it's better in conversation.
No, I agree.
It's just better conversation. I could sit here and we could play Jewish geography all night and...
But we all know the same 5 people. It's done.
So Julie Freeman was at Ramah Poconos.
Taffy Ackner. Okay, yeah, we did it.
I'm just thinking about my friends here in front of me. So you said
actually, Julie from Ramah Poconos is here?
No.
Okay.
I don't even know where that came from. So a crush in 1982.
Monica Lewinsky.
So in the book,
Love her.
You talk about the fear that you have that the Democratic Party is headed towards Jeremy Corbyn and Labor.
I think I'm sounding the alarm on that years before it could happen, but who knows? Donald Trump was elected president, so things happen that we can never expect.
So this is my only thing that I want to bring up that the critics say, which is Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, and like, honestly, I don't even know if AOC and Ayanna Pressley.
Ayanna Pressley does not support BDS.
Yeah, and I don't even know where AOC is on it. So let's just talk about those two. They support BDS. They are a vast minority of the Democratic Party, a vast minority of Congress, and the criticism is Donald Trump compared to AOC and Rashida Tlaib, you can't even compare them.
I agree that you can't compare them. Okay. But let's just be clear, though. Linda Sarsour is a surrogate for Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders has a chance of becoming president of the United States.
But
yes, he does.
Bernie Sanders absolutely has a chance of becoming president of the United States.
He does.
But Bernie Sanders supports Israel. Bernie Sanders worked on a kibbutz. Oh. And the wicked son said.
Line of the night. Here's what I think, though. It's not the numbers. It's
I had some skepticism in the audience.
Is supporting BDS.
But Bernie Sanders does not support BDS.
Hold on.
Okay.
Being anti-Semitic or saying anti-Semitic things and supporting an anti-Semitic movement has become politically survivable in the Democratic Party. That should worry us.
Okay. Let me, because I'm sensing a lot of support for the question I'm about to ask.
Bring it on.
Boy, tough crowd. Very concerned with the fact that Linda Sarsour is on Bernie Sanders' campaign team and Max Berger is on Elizabeth Warren's team. I don't know.
I don't know who that is.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry?
It's a problem, says Helene Wishner, maybe. Okay, I didn't hear that, but we'll come back to you. So both enemies of Israel, BDS, anti-Zionists, Jews, etc. Sadly, many Jews still support them, I suppose, meaning Warren and Sanders. This does not bode well for Israel, nor America's support of Israel. What is your opinion on this? Well, okay,
I agree.
so you're talking about this. So when you are running a campaign, again, let me play devil's advocate. When you are running a campaign, you are in the business of addition, and you want people who will support you. And Linda Sarsour's opinion about BDS is not Bernie Sanders' opinion on BDS.
No.
Same with Max Berger and Elizabeth Warren. Why should that be a factor?
Because if we had a Republican running for office and they had someone who, let's just even say had worked for, I want to find the right analogy, that identified as a member of the alt-right, would that be a news story? You bet it would. And we would have a problem with that. Meaning, and they do, no, I agree. And what I'm saying is, we talk about that, and that's an acceptable thing to be unacceptable, right? Like, there are lines. There are lines. I don't understand why Steve King, to everyone in this room, and everyone that I keep company with, he's an obvious line crosser. He is a white supremacist, or let's just say traffics in white supremacist thinking. That's clear.
He'd endorsed an anti-Semite for mayor of Toronto or something. Yeah.
Okay, yes. I don't understand why it's so hard for people to do the same thing on the left. Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib were about to take a trip to Israel, sponsored by a group called Miftah, which has literally published things glorifying suicide bombers and published the medieval blood libel, as in actually, the Jews need the blood of Christian babies to make their matzah. I'm not making this up.
It's true.
I was, I think, the only person in 45 seconds on CNN to talk about that at all. Somehow that did not become a story. I don't understand that. I don't understand why I wrote a column, I wrote a column 2 years called When Progressives Embrace Hate about the Women's March unseemly ties to people like Louis Farrakhan. Why did it take 2 years then for investigative reporters to look into that? There's a hesitancy and a lack of curiosity about anti-Semitism when it comes from certain sources. And I think that's a problem, because I think we have to fight it wherever it rears its head. And I just want to add one thing, which is this group Miftah, and this is the nature of left-wing anti-Semitism. It speaks in the language that is a siren song to progressive ears, okay, to the ears of so many of us in this room. It says we are for social justice, we're for progress, we're for human rights, we're humanitarian, all those things. Go after this and look at your iPhone, Google Miftah and look at their website. They frame themselves as we promote human rights, global dialogue, pick your buzzword, it's all there. And somehow that's what gets reported, not the actual substance of what they've done.
So you were not the only 45 seconds on CNN that talked about this, because we talked about it both on my Sunday show and on my daily show. And actually in the daily show, David Urban brought it up, a Trump campaign official brought it up, and we quoted you. And then I went to a graphic of something that you had said.
I don't know how my grandma missed that and did not send it to me,
It's
because she
shocking.
watches you religiously.
It's shocking. But we did bring it up, and it is true. This is Hanan Ashrawi's group,
Yes.
Miftah, and it's accurate, the two things you said.
There are lots of other things too, by the way, but those are just the easiest to sum up.
I work for a secular interfaith nonprofit, and there is a lot of Hanukkah anti-Semitism in the office, especially when Israel comes up. How can I have a productive conversations with my far-left coworkers on Israel and Judaism / rising anti-Semitism? And actually, let me just take that.
It's a great question.
It's a great question, and it actually gets into something that you have in your book when you talk about, there's the last part of the book is about what you can do, what to do to fight anti-Semitism. And this is very similar. This is on page 186. I was recently at a Jewish gathering in Berkeley with a middle-aged woman who was telling me and our fellow dinner companions about a permaculture retreat she had just attended. She was gushing about the incredible diversity of the group, how there had been every kind of person, transgender folks, black folks, Latino folks, and so on. This is almost exactly the same thing as the card we got.
Because it's happening everywhere.
But one thing had made her slightly uncomfortable. She said after a good while, one of the people at the retreat had been telling people that the Rothschilds controlled the government and how everyone ought to read the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So my question I actually was going to ask the same question, which is, what would you do? What would you do for the person who wrote the card? What would you do for that woman that you met at Berkeley?
And I just want to say to whoever asked that, dozens of people in this room know exactly what you're talking about, and people, every single community I go to around the country, they talk about being closeted, and they use that language around this issue. So I guess I would just say, like, never ask of yourself what you would never ask of another minority. Would you ever ask someone to swallow that? Never, never. There's a sickness, honestly, like I was so sad after this conversation with the woman, because then we sort of got into it and it was clear that she was hiding herself often in situations, and she had sort of internalized the sense that there was something to be ashamed of or something she had to apologize for about who she was. And I guess I would say I fundamentally reject that, and if anything good can come from this really uncertain moment we're in, it's that, you know, when someone punches you in the gut, you really want to punch back, right? At least I do. But I think the most productive thing that can come from that is to say, okay, I want to punch back, but why? What am I fighting for, right? You don't want to just fight anti-Semitism because, like, the Jewish people did not survive because we positioned ourselves as anti-Semites. We survived because we had some profound and radical ideas and values to offer to the world. And those things are amazing. I mean, these things not just changed Jewish history, they changed all of history. The idea of one God, the idea that idols are fake, the idea that slavery is wrong and that people are free and that human life is sacred. These are Jewish ideas. And I'm just very proud to be part of a civilization that has those to offer to the world. And I'm scared that too many of us have sort of forgotten those things and are believing what our haters are telling us about ourselves. And I would just really encourage everyone in this moment to dig back deeper into the well springs of who we are and what makes us different, and frankly, why we drive people so crazy still, thousands of years later. There's a reason. There was a question I screwed up on Bill Maher, and it wasn't the one that Ilhan Omar is talking about. He asked me, why the Jews? And I said, something that's true about Jesus, and you can watch. I mean, it's of course true that that's sort of like one of the key early anti-Semitic conspiracies is the idea that the Jews get the Roman Empire, the wily Jews, to do their bidding. And thus from that, we get the idea of the Jews as the evil puppeteers who cozy up to power, who punch crazily above their weight and therefore should be suspected. But the reason I really should have given is why the Jews? Because the Jews stand perpendicular often to their surrounding societies. The Jews stand for freedom. And that is the reason we have thrived in this country and why we thrive in liberal democracies that prize freedom. Because we represent freedom by our very existence. The freedom to think differently, to worship differently, to believe differently. If you go back, and this is in the book, this blew my mind. The original anti-Semitic conspiracy theory was from 300 BCE, and it was in Alexandria. At the time, Alexandria was the biggest Jewish community in the world. And the first anti-Semitic conspiracy theory focused on a revisionist history of the Exodus. Why? Because the story of the Exodus upended everything that the surrounding Egyptian culture believed. The surrounding Egyptian culture believed in slavery. It believed that some people were subhuman. And the Jewish story upended all of that. And so it kind of blew my mind that this is the original thing, is that our original founding story is about freedom from slavery. And that drove people nuts, and who we are today still drives people nuts. And I think, if anything, that's a really, really good thing, and we should seize this opportunity.
That is regrettably all the time we have, but I do want to say one thing. What Bari does, whether you agree with everything she says or nothing she says, what she does is not easy. What she does takes a lot of courage. What she does, I'm sure, sometimes feels very lonely. So if you would please give a big round of applause for Bari.